This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza. And right now we're in no man's land.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years with the BBC, Sky and ITN. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I bring context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real insight. For this edition, something a little different. Tessa Chapman is my colleague at ITN's 5 News. She's our chief correspondent and she's just been in Ukraine. She saw a vibrant, open city, Kiev, turn into one battered by bombs and rockets. She joined the thousands of refugees fleeing the capital and saw what happened when they reached the Ukrainian border. And on every step of the way, she talked to the people she met and heard their fears, their misery and their defiance. She did it all with producer Zoe Callis and cameraman Adam Boyle. This is her account of the first week of war in Ukraine. Tessa, very, very good to talk to you. Let's go back to the beginning. When you arrived in Kyiv, what was your first impression when you got there, when you flew in? What sort of city did you find?
It's a beautiful city. I hadn't been there before. And so I was taking everything in as we drove from the airport into the city centre. And we'd been picked up by Maxim, who was our fixer translator. We piled all our stuff in the van and he was giving us a bit of a tour of the city as we went, showing us beautiful old buildings, historic sites. The sky was blue. It was a city that felt quite relaxed. And we were talking to Maxim about the situation, how he was feeling. And he was obviously very aware of the situation with Russia that Putin had recognised the independent states of Donetsk and Luhansk. And he was feeling nervous, but I certainly didn't feel a huge sense of tension. And we asked him to take us to somewhere where we could talk to some ordinary people and ask them about how they were feeling. And I remember we went to a bustling square where people were drinking coffee, going to and from work. It was lunchtime. And we stopped to ask a few people about how they felt about Russia and the situation. And they spoke with an incredible pride about their country and they feared about what was happening in the east, but there was no sense from anyone that a frontline was going to come to Kyiv anytime soon.
And when was that in relation to the invasion?
That was on Wednesday, the day before the invasion.
And even at that stage, people were going about their business and couldn't even contemplate that this could happen?
I wouldn't say they couldn't contemplate it. So people were talking about how they were very worried about their friends and family in the East. People were talking about how they had packed a bag, perhaps, to leave if the very worst happened. But I just didn't get a sense that they thought it would, or certainly wouldn't anytime soon. Now, I'd spoken to a friend of a good Ukrainian friend of mine in London. So she'd put me in touch with a woman called Inna, and we fixed to go and speak to Inna the following day. And she was going to show us the preparations that she'd made in case she needed to flee. She was going to show us the shelters that she would use should there be a bombardment. And she was going to introduce us to some of her neighbours who had joined the Territorial Defence Force. So perhaps I'm wrong in saying people were completely relaxed. They weren't, but they certainly didn't have a sense that anything so desperate was going to happen so soon.
And what were they saying at that stage about Russia or the Russians or about Putin? How did you gauge their feelings about their big eastern neighbour?
I spoke to one elderly lady who actually became quite tearful when I talked about Putin. And she was saying, this is our country. This is our country. How dare he think he can invade the East? How dare he think he can? We're a proud nation and we will fight in the east, and we will fight. And I spoke to a young man called Andre who really stuck with me. He was 30 years old, he worked in software design, and on the Friday, he was telling us he was planning with some of his friends to go to a territorial defence squad training session as a volunteer. He'd never fired a gun before, had no military experience, but he and his friends were planning for what would happen if the Russians were to invade. But as I said, the feeling really strongly was that this was something that was happening in the east, and people talking about Kiev being a front line still felt very far in the future.
When did you first think or realise that something had changed, that something really was happening?
Later that night, on Wednesday night, we started hearing reports, various intelligence reports coming through. There was a lot of talk in our hotel among the journalists that an invasion might be happening from the east. So we were wary overnight. I didn't sleep very much that night. I was watching rolling news channels, seeing what kind of information was coming in, but it was so hard to properly gauge. And then I went to sleep, eventually fell into a very deep sleep, and woke at about 6:45 in the morning to knocking on my door, and it was Zoe, my producer. And I said, are you okay? And because I hadn't woken when she'd phoned me, and she said the invasion started. And I remember feeling really shocked. And she and I went up to the roof of the hotel with our cameraman, Adam, and we've started filming to see if anything was happening. And I remember seeing some warplanes rumbling ahead and thinking, yeah, something's happened here. We called our fixer and translator, Maxim, and his driver brought him to the hotel, and he was white. He was... The blood had gone from him. He was in complete shock. We were asking if he was okay, and he just couldn't comprehend what was happening.
What was the situation with him? Did he have family? Were they in Kyiv? Were they somewhere else? Was he wondering what he should do?
His family were outside Kyiv. He never had any intention to do anything other than stay in the city. He wanted to stay. He wanted to be with his friends. He and his friends have been talking about the situation for a long, long time, and really started discussing what they should do. Should they join the territorial defence squad? Should they start to fight? Maxim was very pleased to have a distraction in that he was helping us to film what was going on, and that's what we started to do. We said we want to go out in the city and see how people are reacting to this. And I can't overemphasise the change in the city overnight. At 10 o'clock the previous night, we'd been in a restaurant that was absolutely packed, buzzing, people having buzzing conversations. And then that morning, it was quiet in Kyiv. The metro was quiet, the streets were quiet, the shops were closed. There were already queues building at ATM machines. There were queues outside pharmacies. So we started talking to some of those people. I remember talking to a girl in the pharmacy queue who runs a charity, a cancer charity in the city, and she was saying, we're stocking up. We're stocking up on food. We're stocking up on all the medicines we need. They had already understood that they might need that siege mentality. Already around us, we could see in the city people with their bags packed, travelling to bus stations, travelling to train stations. We went to the metro station, and there were lots and lots of reservists gathering. We could see dozens and dozens of people in army fatigues who were clearly awaiting instructions. So they all walked into the metro station. And at that point, we heard an air raid siren. And so we decided that was the safest place to go. So we travelled down into the metro station with reservists, but also found the first people sheltering there. And I remember talking to a man who's a photographer with his wife and his 6-month-old baby, who just looked utterly terrified, utterly bewildered. No one could quite believe that it had happened that quickly.
And so there was already an atmosphere of fear compared to the day before. The people were frightened and thought something was coming their way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what did you find that, apart from fear, were people saying they were going to fight as well?
Yeah, certainly. People would say, how dare he? How dare the Russians think they can do this to our city? This is our home. These are our lives. These are our families. How dare someone think that they can change that in an instant? I remember speaking to the Ukrainian friend of a friend, and she was furious. She said, "We're not panicking, but we are furious." I remember that really well.
But some people, of course, did start to leave, and you left as well in terms of following the people who were getting out of the city. Was that because by then people really thought they were going to be in great danger if they stayed in the city, and they wanted to move? This was obviously such a shock. How were people making that decision to get out of Kyiv?
I think reality had hit. And while I described Kyiv on Wednesday as a place that didn't feel to have a huge amount of tension, I think in retrospect that tension had just been bubbling below the surface, and people many of them had tried to ignore it because you don't want to live your life in fear. So I think that tension had been very much bubbling under the surface, and then with air raid sirens and seeing bombs and shells just outside your city, that fear was activated utterly. So I remember we made the calculation then that our choice could well be either to stay and potentially be in the city for quite some time if there did become a siege, or use this window of opportunity to leave and travel with the refugees. And I think lots of people had made that calculation. This could well be our chance. So as gut-wrenching as it is, we're going to get on the road. And I remember the first couple that we spoke to, we waved at them and asked them to pull over as we were in the queue. And a young couple, probably in their late 20s, who were angry and scared and really upset. Anna, the girl, was crying as she was saying, "Putin wants to kill us, and we know he's not going to stop at the military. He will start to kill innocent people." And she said, the world needs to know this. She had left her parents behind in Kyiv, in one of the areas that had just been bombed that morning. They were in a shelter. His parents were following 2 cars behind, and they were getting out of there because they felt they had no choice. They genuinely feared for their lives.
I mean, we've seen the pictures of the enormous traffic jams. I mean, can you give a sense of what that journey was like? I mean, for a start, it looked agonisingly slow, but what did it feel like?
You look out of the window, and I think what struck me you realise that in every single car is a family, a household, a life, packed up and on the move. And then you see these cars as far as the road stretches, and you know that line is going many hundreds of miles beyond. It's quite astonishing. People were 5, 6, 7 to a car, packed in, with this look of bewilderment on their faces. Most people just looking straight ahead with a kind of glassy-eyed look on their face. And there was a man with a parrot on the steering wheel and a cat and a dog in the boot of the car. There were people with 3 adults in the back, 3 children on their laps. And then you look at this family and you think they must have been able to fit 1 or 2 suitcases to contain their entire life into this queue that is now going to who knows where. Some of the people we spoke to did know where they were going. Some were hoping to travel to family further west. Others were hoping to travel onto Poland. Others further afield still, but they were all finding it very hard to understand what was happening.
And when you got to the border, what did you find there? What sort of reception? Was there a system to get people through? Was it chaotic?
Our journey to the border took 2 days, 48 hours, and ours was actually quicker than some some of those people, because there was one point at night where the road was just totally gridlocked, and you realised that people were just bedding down for the night because there was no way that people in the cars were moving at all. And all the time, you'll have seen the pictures as well of people who had got out to walk the last 30 kilometres to the border. So I'm talking 2-year-old children walking, dressed like they're going to the park because they're the clothes that they've got when it's -3 outside. It was utterly awful conditions. So you have these people walking to the border, you have queues and queues of cars, totally and utterly gridlocked. And we, at that point, were allowed by some soldiers to bypass that final part of the queue because we were the press, and we said, we need to get this story out. We need to go and report on this story. And the soldiers asked us if we would take a family on board with us because they were trying to get the people walking to the border in a safer way. So that was just a really heart-stopping moment when this family came on board with us. They had just said goodbye to their dad 10 minutes earlier because men aren't allowed to leave Ukraine. So he was forced to go back to fight. There was a woman with a 6-year-old daughter and her 14-year-old son. And they had packed their lives and livelihoods into a bag and were travelling with us. And I have to say, Andy, I felt it was such a strange feeling bypassing that queue because you feel so guilty that you're leaving these people behind in this awful situation. And we had the privilege of being able to go to the border. But I'm glad we did because it was such a shocking scene. And I think we needed people to see. When we drove up to the border, we'd seen the people walking and we'd seen the queues of cars. And then on our footage, you can hear us inside the car saying, is this it? Oh my God. Because in front of us were hundreds and hundreds of people waiting at the border queue. It was almost totally silent. People were shuffling around in queues, waiting for the soldiers to allow them through, because there would have been an enormous crush if they'd all gone through to border control at the same time. But there was effectively a holding camp of hundreds and hundreds of people. Some had been there for days waiting at the end of this queue. There was no food, there was no shelter, no toilet facilities, and it was utterly freezing. And we very briefly managed to speak to some of those people. I spoke to a woman who had become separated from her children. She told me that she hadn't seen her 4-year-old and 6-year-old for 5 hours because they, in the confusion, had managed to get across the border, but she hadn't. I spoke to an 80-year-old woman who was so completely confused by what was happening. She'd been brought to the border by some distant relatives, and her aim was to go across to Poland to be picked up by her granddaughter. But she didn't realise that she still had to complete this border crossing process. She seemed to think that her granddaughter from Poland was coming to collect her from this side. And so she was saying through our translator, I hope they'll come and pick me up. I hope someone comes and picks me up soon, but I'm so cold. And she said she'd lost consciousness twice. And there was no one there who appeared to be able to help her because there were 4, 5 or 6 soldiers that side of the border just letting people through. And then a man came up to me. He didn't want to appear on camera, but he said, you have to help us, because there was a group of maybe 100 or so men who were African, Asian, Middle Eastern men who weren't allowed to cross the border at that point because the soldiers were prioritising the women and children. The Ukrainian men weren't allowed to cross because they all had to go back to help with the war effort. So there's this other group of completely helpless people who have been told you can come after the women and children, but the women and children keep coming and keep coming. And we had seen the 30-kilometre queue behind us and knew how many more people were still to come.
So they had been stuck for how long?
Some of the men had been stuck for over 2 days.
So an absolutely desperate scene at the border. When you got through, what was the welcome waiting for people on the other side?
It was incredible. There was Polish soldiers waiting with blankets for the 50 or so people who were allowed through at a time. They were waiting with blankets, they were waiting with food and chocolates, and we then walked through their passport control and there were buses waiting to take people to reception centres. There were dozens of volunteers pouring out cups of tea, wrapping children in blankets. And this was 5 o'clock in the morning, perhaps. There was such warmth and compassion on display to a confused, shocked, sad people. And I wouldn't say that there was a sense of relief there yet. It felt too early for that. And there's one woman who I interviewed who didn't speak very good English, but she didn't need to because her interview just really sticks with me. I said, "How do you feel now?" And she said, "Help. Help us." And I said, "Do you want the world to see this?" And she said, "Yes." I didn't want to go. I didn't want to go. I didn't meet anyone who wanted to leave. This wasn't a journey they wanted to take. They all said, "I love Ukraine. I don't want to leave my home. I don't want to go."
Tessa, you're now in a position to leave after all that you've seen and been through, and obviously with what's awaiting Ukraine. How does it feel to you now to be where you are and thinking about all you've seen and what may still be to come?
I think as a reporter, you get used to dipping into people's lives and hearing about their problems, their tragedies, and it's always something that I've found quite hard to deal with, jumping into someone's life and hearing their experiences and then feeling very lucky and privileged to go back to my own and to be able to leave situations. And you do feel guilt about leaving people behind. And I think this situation, more than ever before, it's quite confronting because I can picture so many of the people that we've met. And I remember so many of their names and hearing their stories. And I'm wondering, where are they now? Are they still in the queue? Have they gone on to a different life? The men who I met, the many, many men who were leaving their families and going back to fight, where are they now? Where we, as a crew, have the privilege, as I say, to go on a plane and go back home. It's confronting, I think, more than ever before, a feeling that there are so many people whose lives have been totally torn apart. And I think one other thing I wanted to say about what struck me was the sense of separation that I felt everywhere I looked, because on this journey to the border, there were families arriving at the border or near to the border together, saying their goodbyes, and then the men were turning back to go to Ukraine. So every child I saw had probably just said goodbye to their dad. Until when, I don't know. The families ripped apart. Most people we saw still had family in Ukraine because wider extended families can't leave. So everyone had an elderly relative who is now hiding in a shelter or finding it impossible to leave, or wants to leave but now has no way of getting out. Yeah, it's a desperate situation, really desperate.
Do you think this is going to stay with you for forever now?
Yeah, I'm sure it will. Yeah.
Tessa, thank you very much indeed. You did a fantastic job, and I'm sure you're looking forward to getting home now.
Thank you.
Tessa Chapman, Chief Correspondent for 5 News, now back in the UK, but her thoughts very much still in Ukraine. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for any other podcast, you can email me at andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at @AndyBell5News, and please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.